Thank you. It's good to be here. Two things. First of all, Colonel Birmingham's back there. I told him a little story about a recent interaction I had with somebody in law enforcement, and it's a story of appreciation. I was on the interstate. It was really greasy and kind of icy, and exit 7, the traffic was backed up from exit 8, and I'm kind of a typical civilian driving. I'm like curious, you know, I just want to check out what's going on, more or less get in the way. And there was an officer standing there at exit 7, and I kind of pull over to try to start engaging her in these discussions. And I don't know where you guys get this sort of skill, but, but in a very nice way, where she had her work to do, and I was like on the edge of getting in the way. And there was no time, really, to have a discussion about, you know, what can I do for you? She just stands there ramrod straight, points to the exit, and says, off. I was like gone, all right? And I tell that story in a way because I really admire it. You know, it's so hard, the interactions that, my stepson was in law enforcement for a while. He was in Brattleboro Police Department, and he was in the Burlington Police Department, too. And those interactions you have with the public, where on the one hand, there's an expectation on the part of the public that you'll be nice to us, that you'll treat us right, and that we can just take for granted that you'll keep us safe. But on the other hand, the job you have, where that's your goal, but you never know, and 95, 99% of the time, everything's fine. But it's not always fine. And you've got to be making that judgment at that moment right away, prepared for literally the worst that could possibly happen. So that walking that balance and that emotional balance and that professional balance, that's a lot harder than me dealing with people who are mad at me about some vote. And I just want to say thank you for that. The second thing that I want to talk a little bit about is this legislation that just got passed that's going to come up with $1 billion over the next couple of years to go back to local community organizations and police organizations to help on opioid epidemic. And this is the, putting it in a broader context, what Eric was just talking about, where you actually have to deal with these infrastructures in communities, like a house where you're selling, and come up with practical tools to deal with it. And where the whole opioid epidemic, for a lot of people who are using it, you can call it a health problem, call it whatever you want, but it really tears at the fabric of the community. And it actually has devastating consequences for the individual who's using, oftentimes has devastating consequences for their kids, for their family. And the leadership that I think Vermont law enforcement has taken in emphasizing not just the law enforcement component of that, but the community the community component of it, where a lot of the attraction in the desperation that's in people's lives, where they start using things that are just going to really destroy their lives, takes a big community response. And I think of Chief Baker in Rutland when he started Project Vision, and where what that is requiring of our folks in law enforcement is to have a much broader definition of your job. You know, if all it is that you have to do is just enforce the law, you know, the traffic laws, the criminal code, that's a hard job with a lot of danger associated with it, and it's essential you do it assertively and you do it well and consistently. But so much of what is being asked of you is to be leaders in the community element of what causes communities to start falling apart and families to start fraying. That's a much harder and much more multifaceted task. And this is where I remember talking to my stepson John about this, where the job is not just showing up when the call comes in. It's really having a kind of depth of understanding about what's going on in the community, what has to be done, how you have to rebuild the whole community and use whatever variety of tools may be there. And that's oftentimes working with crisis counselors. It's obviously working a lot with mental health. It's oftentimes working with your local select boards. And the expectations that we have of you are in many ways unlimited, because there is a security that individuals, people have, we have, that if we call law enforcement, that's where you go when you just can't go anywhere else and you got to get it done. And it comes oftentimes with an expectation, it's not really founded in reality, that somehow, some way you can solve the problem. It might be a person in a house who has a severe mental health problem, and the family is desperate. They don't know what to do, and they call the doctor, or they call the hospital, they call mental health, it doesn't work, and they finally call you. And the expectation is somehow, some way, you're going to figure it out. So that's a lot to ask, because just because you have the badge, and with the badge have, I think especially in Vermont, an immense amount of respect for the authority that goes with that, it doesn't mean you have all the solutions for everything. So I just want to start out by acknowledging the challenge that you face in what I think is an expanding definition among the public of what it is we can expect of you. And it's not fair for us to expect that without providing the resources and also listening to you and getting from you the practical suggestions on what are the other things that other parts of civic organizations in government has to do. So I was very happy. You know, this Congress I'm in, we don't really have a lot to brag about what we're getting done, and who knows what's going to happen next year. But this legislation that we got passed, where there was some money, and in Washington, anytime we're talking about money, it's a real battle. But there's $1 billion that'll be coming back to the communities regarding opioids. And the aspect of it that I am really most pleased about is that it's going to go to local organizations. It's not just going to get funneled into the existing bureaucracy. There's going to be an effort to look around and see where those community organizations, local police departments are dealing with the opioid epidemic, and have the money go there with the knowledge in Washington that any success has to be locally led. This is not something that can be, micromanaged from DC. It has to be organic to the local communities, where you're making those fine point decisions about which organizations are getting the job done, which houses we have to go after because they are being used to promote the sale of opioids, where local leadership is the only leadership that's going to have a shot at being able to get the job done and to make some progress on it. Doug, I just know down in Springfield, you've been dealing with this for a long time, and the community's getting more and more involved. But your department is always a central element of that. So that is one thing where I think we made the right choice, and it was Republicans and Democrats acknowledging that our only hope on making real progress is to use the local infrastructure, the local organizations that are focusing on it. So thank you for that. And the next year is going to be a whole new year. I mean, it'd be interesting to get some of your questions about President Trump. And if you had asked me, did I think that Donald Trump was going to be elected president 2 years ago, a year ago, 6 months ago, or 2 days before the election, I would have said, no how, no way. And he's elected, and he really did extremely well in working class districts all across the country, rural areas and small towns and small communities, where a lot of the folks who are living there are the folks who are the ones most threatened by the opioid crisis. And it's really a lot of folks who, as this economy has changed so much, and in many ways grown, those are the folks that have largely been left behind. And they are not in the labor force. They had a job that was paying good money, and they've lost it. and they're getting jobs that are paying minimum wage, or they're dropping out of the labor force. And that's a prescription for real trouble down the line. So those folks largely gravitated towards electing Donald Trump because he spoke, I have to acknowledge, he spoke to their anxieties. But this is going to be a huge adjustment. I've generally, when I've been in the state Senate for quite a while, and now serving in Congress, this is my 10th year, I've always had kind of a feel about how to do the job, or I thought I did. Sort of like you guys, whatever situation you're showing up for, you kind of feel, if it's domestic or it's really a very serious situation involving weapons, you have a feel for how you're going to do your job. And sometimes it's easier than others, sometimes it's really hard. It's a whole new world for us in D.C. And when I returned, the Democrats were, of course, dismayed that Clinton lost, or Trump won maybe is what we were dismayed about, and discouraged, because it's now a whole new world with the Republican leadership in the House, the Senate, and the presidency. My Republican colleagues were dismayed because none of them thought Donald Trump was going to win, but they were delighted, and we're going to see how it goes. And my approach on this is going to be to do what I've always done. If there's common ground, I'm going to try to work real hard. But this is the aspect of the campaign that was disturbing to me. If there's essentially a lot of bad rhetoric about people because of their religion, because of their ethnicity, or if there's some desire to start infringing on constitutional rights, that's a line I'm going to do everything I can to resist and not have that be crossed. You have a very challenging job in a very difficult situation oftentimes with people who expect a lot but then get angry at you that you haven't solved the problem. But what you've managed to accomplish, in my view, I've lived in Vermont all my professional life. After I got out of law school, I came here and I was a public defender. So a lot of the people you were arresting, I was defending. And in all of those years that I served in Vermont in politics and as a lawyer, what I've seen is that we have a law enforcement community that really enjoys very significant respect from the community. And that's not the case all around the country, for some reasons that are understandable and some that aren't. But that's something that is only built by the day in and day out relationship that you establish with the people you're serving and protecting. And again, that's a big challenge because oftentimes the expectation is definitely there on the part of the public that you're going to protect us, but it's taken for granted and there's not an appreciation about what it takes in order to get that job done. And oftentimes, people who have whatever issues are troubling them want to blame you for what that problem is. And how do you manage that just on a day-to-day basis where, to some extent, certain situations you've got to be very authoritative and forceful. Other times you've got to kind of turn the other cheek and understand that this is a person venting and it's not, you can't, quote, take it personally, which is asking a lot of people, but you have to do that an awful lot of the time. So bottom line here, we in Vermont, I think, I give Governor Shumlin a lot of credit for this, identified a problem that wasn't unique to Vermont, but we named it, and that's the opioid crisis. When he gave his State of the State address and focused just on that, a lot of my colleagues in Washington really came up to me and said, you guys are talking about that? And I said, yes. And they said, aren't you afraid? And I said, we're not, because denying the existence of the problem is the last thing you can do if you want to have a serious chance at solving it. And then gradually, everyone was acknowledging that they were having the same problem in their community that we were acknowledging was happening in our community. And that naming of it, I think, was really essential in trying to face it in a unified way. And the project vision and the work of Chief Baker over there is an example I often give of, I think, what is a very constructive community approach, where we're acknowledging that we're all in it together and law enforcement is part of it, but not all of it. But there's got to be cooperation among all the players who are involved in trying to rebuild our communities. So let me stop there and open it up if you have any questions or comments. But I do want to end by saying thank you to you for the work that you do, for the courtesy that you show to Vermonters in doing what is, day in and day out, a pretty hard job, important job. Any questions or comments? I don't know how many people here have stopped me along the highway, but... Doug.
I guess the one thing that affects all law enforcement agencies in Vermont is recruitment. And
right.
Obviously, some of the things that have come out of the White House obviously has not been a positive thing for law enforcement nationwide. And I look at what's happening in Vermont and seeing my colleagues here are getting to the age of retirement. And once they start retiring, how are we going to replace the individuals? Even I'm having a hard time filling one spot down in Springfield. How are we going to get people interested in getting back into law enforcement? When I first got into law enforcement, there was a strict competition for it. Back when I was 19 years old, and a lot of people weren't touching people unless they're 21 or older. How do we get to that point, I guess, that struggle of getting people interested back in law enforcement?
You know, I don't have the answer to that, but I know that is a huge problem. And I don't know how much of the bureaucracy or some of the requirements are just getting a little bit out of hand in getting in the way of making good judgment by a police chief about who you think is qualified. You know, yesterday I was up at Customs and Border Patrol at Highgate, and I was talking with the folks up there, and they told me that between the time somebody applies and they get a yes or no is like 16 months. And that's just too long. I mean, I don't know what's involved in that process, but that's way too long. Because just think about yourself if you're applying. You've got to wait 16 months. You might have your heart set on doing this job, and those are higher paying jobs. You know, those are pretty good paying jobs. So it's really, really tough. And also they've got, I guess Congress has passed a requirement that everybody go through a polygraph test. And I don't know what you guys think about that, but that would scare me. I mean, that would be kind of a disincentive for me. You know, you can go through all my background and everything. I don't know if that's an example of what they have to go through, the 16-month process that gets in the way of you being able to make a decision. The other thing that's really tough up there is that that's making it very, very difficult for Vermonters to apply even for those jobs, even though if you get a Vermonter in one of these jobs, the likelihood is that a person's going to want to stay on. You don't have the retention problem as much. So I don't have an answer, Doug, but I know that's a problem. And if you're telling me that there's some things coming out of Washington that is making it more difficult without benefit, you know, because obviously you've got to be confident in who you're allowing to wear the badge, I'd be interested in that. Yes, sir.
Congressman, I'm sure you're aware of how many police officers have been killed this year in line of duty. It seems like police officers have a target on their back, either through malicious intent or through the media. And I don't think the problem is the bureaucracy. I think it's the overall opinion. Now, if you look at Vermonters, you talk to the average Vermonter, they're very proud of their police officers, law enforcement in the state, and they should be, because they're the best in the United States, the best in the world. However, even though we have been somewhat removed from some of the things that have been going on around the country, you talk to a young kid now, and they're looking at that, it's not the application process. They don't make a whole heck of a lot of money when you look at what they're being charged to do. Now they need to be mental health workers, they need to be able to make life or death decisions in the spur of the moment. Training requirements becoming more and more stringent, which they should, that's fine. But if you look at what's going on, and these kids are all on the internet, they're all on their cell phones.
Right.
And every day, another police officer is getting killed, another police officer is getting killed. It needs to stop. And there needs to be a loud voice from Washington. And I'm not saying that people have, but there needs to be a louder voice. Because I'll tell you, some kids are looking at this now, and they're thinking, well, geez, if I make a mistake, now my name is going to be smeared across the media. And I'm guilty before I'm proven, I'm guilty before any other process takes place. It's a frightening world. not only for the people that think about becoming police officers, but for those of us that are police officers. And never did I ever think that men and women that wear the uniform would be afraid to wear some kind of a symbol on their person, off-duty, which identifies them as a police officer. And we see that here in Vermont.
Well, that's
It's a sad state
yeah.
of affairs when now, the proudest profession next to military, we have to worry about having a target on our back because we're being ostracized.
Well, I share that view with you. I mean, I went around and visited some of you after that unbelievable execution, that's all you can call it, in Dallas. I mean, that was an execution of police officers. And it was deliberate, and the reason a person was targeted in that case is because they were wearing a uniform, and that's appalling. And what I'm hearing you say, I think, is that there's a culture out there that's making it so that some pretty sick people decide they're doing something good by targeting a police officer, and that's outrageous.
Well, the negative press feeds those people.
Right.
And we become the target, like that police officer sitting there writing the ticket.
Yeah, and you know what? Here's what's so hard. When you're the sheriff, you're the police chief, you are so concerned about the well-being of the people that serve under you, the men and women, and you're concerned not just about their physical safety, you know, have them be trained right. You're concerned about their emotional well-being. You want to have good morale. And the world we're in has a lot of the things you're talking about. You know, but it also has some other things. You know, thank goodness it's not really a big issue in Vermont. But where in some places there has been excessive force by people in uniform against innocent civilians. It's happened. It's not anything you would condone, but I don't think it's anything any of us can really deny. It's happened, okay? And the challenge for the leadership, this is why I think your job is so hard, is that you are living in this world where you don't create the whole context of how people see you or how you are seen. But you've got to deal with that. And the best I can, when I talk to some of our chiefs, you are aware of that, but you're reaching out constantly in your community to establish those connections where you're seen as a person who not only wears a uniform and has the authority that goes with that, but you care about where you are. You care about the people you're trying to serve. And the hard part of your job is there's a lot of folks, I don't know how many here, but there's folks who don't respect that. And when one is disrespected, or even harder, when some people that are under your supervision, who you're there to protect, when they're not respected for the work they're doing, and you know how hard they work, and you know what it costs them and their family, and you know the anxiety that goes along with that insecurity when you're out there and you don't know what's going to happen, you're really upset about that. So there's not a quick answer, but it is important there be acknowledgement that the police, the sheriffs, the public safety folks are doing something that's really essential. And I have confidence in Vermont that you get it. The last thing you want to do is use force that doesn't need to be used. That's not why you're out there, okay? And that's what the training is so important about. And that's where the judgment, Doug, about who you hire is so important. Because we all know there's some folks who shouldn't be doing the job they're doing, whether it's being in Congress, and you get to throw me out, you know, if you think that's the best thing, or wearing a uniform, or, you know, being in front of a bunch of kids as a teacher. So thank you for that, but good luck. Yes, sir.
First off, I could, Congressman, what's that thing on your shirt?
That's national intelligence, following the news. That's for the local TV. They're recording our visit.
That's fine.
Okay.
Most everyone I have a conversation with kind of reiterates what you said coming in about, you know, we were kind of taken back by the election. And for those of us that do, I follow politics more than I should, and that's why I act the way I do. But what I took away from that is that was a wake-up call to the people in Washington and to
Yeah.
our elected officials that you're not paying enough attention to the right people. And what I personally took away from that is a lot of people were supportive of certain candidates, and people didn't know it because there was somehow or other reluctance to talk about it. But, you know, whether you be a politician or a law enforcement officer or a town representative, whether you agree with the current mindset of President-elect Trump or not, I think you have to listen to the people, and the people have spoken. And I think part of that message is we're not being taken care of by our folks in Washington as the way we have felt that they should. And my question would be to you or any of the other elected officials representing us in Washington, did you take that similar type message from that vote, not necessarily the agenda of President-elect, but that vote that came out by way of the electoral vote? Did you take anything away from that that maybe perhaps you're not tending to the right side of the fire all the time?
You want to know something? That's exactly what I took out of it. And I actually got in some disputes with my Democratic colleagues when we got back because, you know, we had a caucus and we're all dismayed. And, you know, we picked up a few seats, but we're in the wilderness. And a lot of people complained about Comey, and a lot of people complained about the hacking. And a lot of people complained about some of the decisions Hillary made in her campaign, not spending time here or there. And a lot of people complained about some of the things that Trump said, and that provoked people. But I said, you want to know something? We can pick a half a dozen issues that made a difference tactically in this campaign. But here's one thing that the Democrats own, and that is that people in rural America, in small town America, working class America, who we like to think are people we're representing, said we're not. They repudiated us. That we own. That's not on Comey. That's not on Russia hacking. That's not on tactical decisions that Hillary made. That's on us. We're not. It shows we didn't connect with them emotionally, and whatever policies we have, they don't feel they're getting. I run into Vermonters all the time. You guys do too. I mean, you're dealing with people who are on the economic edge a lot of the time. You know, it's pretty rare you get called to go to a home, might be a domestic, involving somebody who's got a really good job. So you're dealing day in and day out, and you're seeing some of those folks where the grind of trying to make it wears them down and they start doing bad things. But you also see those Vermonters where the grind, they just find a way to endure, to help one another, and to get ahead. And we're not connecting there, a lot of us in Washington. I agree with that. And that's the real challenge. So I appreciate you saying that, but that's exactly what I heard. Guess, Doug, you get the last question.
Okay, I guess what my concern is, I mean, a lot of things came out that were good out of the Century 21st Policing Task Force. But I guess what gets me is they have representation from your larger cities in there and not from the common size of the police departments throughout this nation. We don't all have 100, 200, 300, or thousands of things. So when stuff comes out of that that affects the local smaller PDs, we should have representation on that also.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, again, this election, it goes to what we were just discussing. Rural America and small town America is sort of on the outs. I mean, it's everything from the broadband that you absolutely have to have, just like you have to have electricity, to the respect for the reality that rural America and small town America is really vital, and we can't leave those lives behind. So I agree with you. Now, I think in this, and I'll be fighting for that, but what I do like about this particular funding is that it's going to go back into those communities and states where they're facing the opioid epidemic, and where it's going to go to local agencies as opposed to be administered from Montpelier or Washington, really. So thank you very much. Chief?
Just regarding that funding, can we anticipate like how it would show up like communities already have partnerships with the treatment and prevention side, like my state.
Here's what we're doing now, or what's going to happen now is they've got to write regulations, always a hassle, but this is where I think you guys can be helpful, because we can write a letter and be advocates about how it should be distributed. And, you know, Ryan from my office is here, and Senator Leahy, you'll be, who is very involved in this as well. We ought to try to get that input where we're making the points you're saying about that local coordination. How does it work practically? You're the ones who know that much better than I do, okay? So our office and Senator Leahy's office, and I'm sure Senator Sanders' office would be glad to advocate for the regulations that give us the best shot at the most productive use of that money. Thank you.
Thank you, Con.
Good luck, you guys. Chief, yep, see ya. Steve.